Good morning. We are live and on the air. And today we will continue our reading from Israel, the Two Halves of the Nation, my father's book. And we're still reading about the Zionists. We still haven't gotten to Palestine itself so much. And this is going to be controversial because right now, we're not allowed to ever tell anybody that we think they're rotten or they're not good enough or they need to pull up their pants or whatever. But it's actually part of the Hebrew tradition from time immemorial. I mean, there are entire books of the Bible that are dedicated to saying the people are not good enough, the people are rotten, a curse on the people. So it's actually a tradition of very long standing. And I know we're going to ruffle some boots, but sometimes I think that maybe even libertarians should try to do this sometime, that it might be okay to say to people who are just going along with everything, you're being a slave. You are just enabling everything that is being done to you. And if you don't stand up and fight for your rights, you won't have your rights. And it isn't all just about educating people. So I'm going to be reading you a closer look, which is on page 5. But first of all, we want to try to share this with the world. And I will turn my camera around so that anybody who has an interest and is available at this time of day will be able to join us. And I'm going to my other computer. By the way, I have here a poem by Bialik on my screen here. אכן נבל העם מלא נקלה וראש, כולו רקב ומסוס מכף רגל ועד ראש, or something along those lines. This is Bialik, but that won't help me share. Oh, open this page door so that Summer can come out. Summer is molting and he doesn't look good right now. I know. Okay. I'm going to go into my own live stream and share it on Twitter. And share it. Okay, it has been shared. So without further ado, let's continue with our reading. Had he obtained a charter, Herzl's plan would still have failed. Most Jews had no desire to segregate themselves in what they viewed as the wilderness of Palestine. Religious Jews in Europe speaking Yiddish claimed to be piously waiting for a heavenly Messiah. The growing population of assimilated Jews speaking the language of their respective countries maintained that their ethnicity and religion were a private matter. In between, semi-liberated Jews expected to maintain Jewish cultural autonomy in Yiddish or Hebrew within existing national units. Individual families from the lower classes were voting with their feet. More than 2 million of them set out in search of a more prosperous life in America. All of them were committed to the principle that people of diverse origins and religions should live together harmoniously. And that doesn't sound so bad, does it? Okay. If a charter were granted him, Herzl would have been unable to uphold his side of the bargain and deliver the 10 million immigrants he promised. This was amply demonstrated when the Balfour Declaration, which was some sort of a charter, brought with it a brief period of unrestricted immigration. The Jewish community did not exploit it. Even if all the Jews of Europe or the world could be persuaded or forced to come, that would be only the start of the problems. The Jewish population was oriented to service and commerce. It lacked a labor pool. It could not man a self-sufficient economy. The practical Zionists in Palestine and abroad struggled with these issues. Typically, they were intellectuals drawn from well-to-do or at least scholarly families. They were oddballs who preferred the far-out utopian dream of reversing the flow of time and history in Palestine to the living, exciting realities and in-place utopias of Europe and the Western world. The ranks of the Zionists were, on the most part, filled with graduates, albeit renegade graduates, of the traditional Jewish upbringing. They had read the scriptures in the original Hebrew. They had specific acquaintance with the lost glories of ancient Israel. They had a positive vision. Edelson was a theorist among them. He had undergone traditional schooling and was fully qualified as a rabbi. However, since by that time he was a non-believer, he did not choose to make his living that way. He was also a graduate of Moscow University and had accumulated broad knowledge in history, the social sciences, and the natural sciences. An academic career seemed indicated, but in quota-driven Russia, that would have required Edelson to convert out of the Jewish community. He did not care to do that either. For a while, he made his living as an accountant. Edelson had been active in pre-Zionist and Zionist groups in Moscow since the late 1880s. In 1905, he was offered the position of editor-in-chief of the Russian-language Zionist periodical Rasviet, or actually Rasviet. There's a Z there in the romanization, which makes it look like Rasviet, as in Rasvetali Yablani Krushi. But it's not Rasviet, it's Rasviet, meaning dawn, not flowering. Okay, the periodical, there's a note that says the periodical was initially called Chronika Yevreysky Zhizni, Chronicles of the Jewish Life. In 1906, the name was changed to Yevreysky Narod, Jewish Nation. In 1907, it was changed again to Rasviet. The publication is remembered by this last name. Note that etymologically, Yevreysky is Hebrew. However, in Russian, this is merely a polite way of saying Jewish. It has nothing to do with the specific meaning of Hebrew as introduced in section 4 and in chapter 2. Okay. So anyway, he was the editor of Rasviet, which had been founded in St. Petersburg the previous year. Edelson accepted, and at the age of 40, he moved to St. Petersburg to take the position in which he would make his impact. The editorial panel of Rasviet was a group of students whose ages ranged from 21 to 24 and who were all comers in the Zionist movement. Gepstein was one of them. The most prominent was Vladimir Jabotinsky, who later, with his first name changed to Ze'ev, would become the revered leader of the militant right wing of the Zionist movement. He would be banished from Palestine by the British because of his open advocacy of revolt. After independence, Israel would accord him a state burial close to the remains of Herzl himself. Edelson's management soon drove the circulation of Rasviet from 3,000 to 35,000. Hey, that's good. Rasviet continued to appear regularly until 1919. The Bolshevik Revolution brought about the end of Rasviet in Russia. Edelson died in 1921. The Rasviet was renewed for a while in Paris. This time, Jabotinsky was the editor. Starting in 1931, the Paris Rasviet carried a series of visionary articles by one Adolphe Gurevich, who signed with the Arabic pen name Al-Raed and who later adopted the name Choron. Jabotinsky did not endorse all of Choron's ideas, but he did not reject them out of hand either. We will meet Choron in person in chapter 9, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Edelson contributed his own fundamental articles to each issue of Rasviet. He also motivated his younger colleagues and stimulated their thinking. Jabotinsky later wrote, Zionism in Russia was a very primitive movement. On the issue of a common national life, there was childish naivete that today could hardly be believed. The accepted scheme for the realization of Zionism in those days was this. On the one hand, we need to instill in the Jewish people great enthusiasm. On the other hand, to collect a lot of money. Also to build colonies and factories in Palestine. In the meantime, Theodor Herzl will negotiate and get some sort of paper, and then tens of thousands of Jews will board ships and come to Palestine. Various influences were required to shake these childish views about the scope and means of the movement. Jabotinsky credits Edelson with achieving that end. Jabotinsky goes on to say that there is a gap between the intellectuals who conceive new ideas and the ordinary people who are supposed to implement them. Ideas remain barren unless a person is found who can translate them for the masses. Jabotinsky credits Edelson with this ability. Okay, because if you actually met people in Israel who had been Zionists and who were also agricultural, you couldn't really talk with them about these ideas. Many of them were not very articulate. So yeah, there's a difference between a foot soldier on the ground and the people who think up the ideas, and somebody does have to coordinate between them. The same motif comes to us from other sources. Ben Yehuda makes mention of his Russian friend, Cheshnikov, who sees things in the world the way they are and not through broken and corrupted light rays as they appear to the eyes of those of the bent brains that reside in the twisted heads of exiled Jews. Ben Yehuda, page 66. Okay. Bialik, the national poet, lashed at the Jewish people. Yes, the people is low and dishonored to boot, all muck and decay from its head and to its foot. Such statements indicting an entire community are considered today politically incorrect. What do you think about that? Is it ever okay to say the people are rotten? And what would be achieved by that? But the thing is, it used to be something that people used to say to students, to children. It used to be okay to point out to someone that they were not as good as one would want them to be. And teachers would call students idiots every time they made a mistake. And now we're told we're never allowed to do that. We're never allowed to use negative language. We're always supposed to find a positive way to say things. But that's not how it was then. And saying the negative things seemed to work pretty well. So that's just something I'm pondering too. Have we been too easy on our children? Should we be meaner? Anyway, they were nevertheless essential to the development of Zionism, these negative statements. The very essence of the movement was a program of re-education. Okay. The people must be prepared for the task, and if they could not make the grade, their children would. Moses, too, had found the slaves he led out of Egypt unfit for a free nation. He had to while away 40 years in the Sinai desert until a free generation took root before the settlement of Palestine could begin. No wonder that similar circumstances call for similar measures. Bialik developed this analogy. There was a great deal of talk about the desert generation. Nobody was as blunt as Edelson on the deficiencies of contemporary Jews. If human beings could be compared to fish, meaning live fish swimming in water, then the Jews were pickled herrings. The herring doctrine was set in an article called Rasol, which is the Russian term for the salty brine in which the herrings were preserved. The article appeared in 1902 in the Russian periodical Vodochnost. I don't know, Vodochnost. A Hebrew translation is available in the Edelson book, which the Zionist organization published in Edelson's memory in 1946 on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of his death. Lassalle goes on in some length into the history of the Jews. It explains how, following defeat, a strategy of collective survival evolved that denied life itself with all its joys. The salted fish can last indefinitely, but the price is being dead. The purpose of Zionism was to bring these fish back to life. In his summary, Edelson states, Zionism is the return to the pre-Jewish principle and a total repudiation of Judaism. Okay. Edelson book, page 122. Okay, so what are we saying? Okay, as long as you're alive, and the linguists say this about language, as long as a language is alive, it changes, it evolves. As long as a being is alive, it tends to assimilate to its environment. If you want to preserve a language and have it not change, it's going to be a dead language. It's going to be somehow calcified. But the thing is, the linguists that I know don't believe that languages can be revived. And yet Hebrew was revived, Hebrew culture was revived, and it is possible to revive something that was ancient by taking it out of preservation. So in that sense, traditional Judaism served a purpose. Without it, Zionism couldn't have happened. But once Zionism was ready to happen, it was time to debunk or get rid of traditional Judaism. Edelson touches on a basic problem of semantics and orientation. Once the Zionist educational program is complete, are its graduates Jews of a new non-exile type, or are they no longer Jews? The term Jew, being a derivative of Judean, was coined in the Babylonian exile. The people of the first temple never used it. They were the children of Israel. The Jewish Second Temple was historically and conceptually closer, but the glories of ancient Israel, which the Zionists were seeking to renew, were much more prominent during the pre-Jewish First Temple. In fact, it was the First Temple that Zionism was trying to resurrect. And there's more on that in section 5. This was the trend all the way through the 40s. This was also the reason that once independence was won, the new state adopted the name of David's kingdom, Israel, rather than that of Herod's, Judea. Blunt as the herring doctrine was, the potato doctrine must have been even blunter. So much so that Gepstein did not dare publish it in 1946. Gepstein had the potato doctrine in the form of a Russian language manuscript covering a lecture that was given in Moscow in 1898. I was unable to find this manuscript, my father says. So we know there's a potato manuscript, well, we don't have it. Apparently, Edelson compared the sacred values and traditions of Judaism to potatoes. If you like them, eat them. Otherwise, stay away from them. I don't know why that's so controversial. That's kind of my attitude toward potatoes too. Actually, I used to love to eat potatoes, but I don't anymore. Jewish heritage need not be embraced as a whole, nor should it be rejected as a whole. It must be approached selectively. The guiding principle is not an obligation to the past, but rather the needs of the future. Edelson applied this principle to specific issues. His intricate reasoning often came out in favor of the past. He determined that ancient Hebrew, not contemporary Yiddish, must be the language of the emerging nation. When Herzl was prepared to trade Palestine for Uganda, Edelson successfully led the opposition. Nevertheless, selection was required. Many Jewish traits, traditional and contemporary, were to be cast aside. So this gives you an idea of why it is that some of the greatest critics of Zionism were diasporic Jews, and why right now there are people who are aghast at my reading from my father's book. But this is Israel, the Two Halves of the Nation by Amnon Katz. I'm his daughter, and I will continue to share this with you in small, digestible portions. So have a wonderful day. And if you like potatoes, eat them. And if you don't like potatoes, don't eat them. And may every person do as he sees fit, as it was in the days of the judges.